So a very warm welcome to all of you. Uh, Good evening, India. Good morning, America. Good night, good evening in Tokyo. And, uh, and greetings to everyone from other geographies. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, friends from India and all over the world, ladies and gentlemen. It's my delight and privilege to welcome you to today's virtual panel discussion entitled The Quad Way, a Force for Global Good. My name is Manish Chand. I'm founder and CEO of India Rights Network and Center for Global India Insights, a think tank of foreign strategic advisory that focuses on geopolitics and actionable foreign policy analysis. We also publish India and the World, a foreign policy magazine journal that has carved a niche among the diplomatic and strategic community in India. For more on our organization and activities, you can log on our website, www.indiarights.org. In the last few years, we have organized several seminars, physical as well as virtual, on different reasons and themes. These panel discussions have been marked by the participation of eminent speakers, very high quality of discussion. We hope that our webinar today will live up to our reputation and raise the bar for informed discussion of foreign policy issues. This webinar builds on a panel discussion we had organized in the aftermath, the first in-person summit in Washington last year, called Quad, the Power of Four. Dear friends, we are meeting at a time when the world order continues to be assailed and challenged from South China Sea, South Pacific Islands, and from Ukraine to Myanmar, making uncertainty the only certainty in the world. On a beautiful, radiant afternoon in Tokyo on May 24, the leaders of India, Japan, Australia, and leaders of India, Japan, Australia, and US scripted a new chapter in their journey, marked by solidarity, creativity, and action-oriented cooperation to secure the rules-based order against coercive, provocative, and unilateral action that change the status quo and violate sovereignty of the nations. I was there in Tokyo for this summit, privileged to see all this upfront. The rapport and connect among the leaders of the was quite visible. What was remarkable was that the four leaders, spoke in a similar language about shared interests, including freedom of law, democratic values, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. The overarching message coming out from the Tokyo summit were loud and clear. Bullying and coercion will not be tolerated, but stoutly resisted by the region and especially Quad countries. The Tokyo summit, in a sense, marks a visible movement forward as a pressure group, as a formidable pressure group against three C's: chaos, coercion, and conflict, and has come to be associated in the public mind with three G's, that is good, growth, and goal-oriented. Like before, there were no explicit, like before in the previous editions of the Quad summit, there was no overt mention of China in the Quad joint statement, but Beijing was the subtext of the intra-Quad discussion. Intra-Quad cooperation to maintain freedom of navigation in the South China Seas prominently in discussion, culminated in a joint statement to champion adherence to international law, particularly as reflected in the UNCLOS and the maintenance of freedom of navigation and overflight. Many key initiatives that emerged from the Tokyo summit were animated by the collective strategy to constrain China's rules-bending behavior. These included, among others, the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness, IPMDA, and the establishment of the Quad Partnership on Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief in the Indo-Pacific, in a move designed to provide an alternative to China-led Belt and Road Initiative. Quad leaders also decided to extend more than $50 billion USD infrastructure assistance and investment. Put together, these multifarious but interlinked initiatives mark the consolidation and strengthening the geopolitical agenda of the group. Now, very briefly, let me unpack the master theme of today's webinar, the Quad Way, a force for global good. There are two parts of this formulation. First, the Quad Way. The panel today will explore and discuss whether there is any such thing as a Quad Way, or is it just a feel-good rhetorical construct? If there is a Quad Way, then what are its distinguishing features? President Joe Biden has provided some pointers in his remarks at the Washington summit as well as at the Tokyo summit. He underlined that the Quad is a vivid example. Democracies deliver better. The second part is about the Quad's positioning and branding as a force for good, a formulation first proposed by Prime Minister Modi in his address at the first in-person summit in Washington, and this message was amplified again at the Tokyo summit. The joint statement of the Tokyo summit endorses this formulation of the Quad as a force of good. This formulation has to be seen against the backdrop of attempts by some countries to portray Quad as a divisive force or an Asian NATO. We know who we are talking about. In this context, the discussion today will look at how the Quad countries can collaborate, promote the Quad. Looking ahead, the webinar will try to explore and map future directions of the grouping and the role it can play in promoting peace, prosperity, and stability in the Indo-Pacific. Going by the 4 summits we had, virtual and 2 physical, the Quad looks like set to go from strength to strength. And not only the Quad is not only set to grow, but will branch out probably in new areas such as space operation, infrastructure building, and maritime domain awareness, as identified by the May 24 summit. At the webinar today, we have seasoned diplomats and analysts who will address the gathering, very distinguished gathering, and we have a truly stellar panel. Let me introduce them very briefly right now. Dr. Arvind Gupta, Director, Vivekanand International Foundation, VIF, a prominent Delhi-based think tank. Mr. Tomohiko Taniguchi needs no introduction, like all other speakers, but basically he served as advisor, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and those who know, he was the driving force behind that iconic speech called Confluence of the Two Seas. We have Sachin Chaturvedi, Director General at the RIS, Research and Information System for Developing Countries. He's an author and a prolific speaker and commentator on foreign policy issues and issues relating to development cooperation. We have with us Honorable Lisa Singh, heads Australia-India Center, with a sterling job in promoting and strengthening India-Australia relations, and the kind of momentum you see in India-Australia partnership is partly also driven by people like the Honorable Lisa Singh. Richard Rosso, the Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he holds a Wadhwani Chair in India-US Policy Studies. His writings illuminate different facets of the burgeoning partnership between India and the United States, that President Obama has famously called the defining partnership of the 21st century. And last but not the least, Madam Nancy Snow, who's a public figure, a professor of public diplomacy, a communication specialist, and many more. And of course, a prolific commentator, foreign policy issues. So we have a truly eclectic audience from different geographies. We have 2 speakers from Japan, from India, 1 from Australia. So we have a miniature quad here. And let me go ahead with today's discussion. Just before I hand over, I invite speakers to deliver their address in response to my question. This is for the audience. Have any questions, there is a chat box. You can type in your question. We'll come back to you. Please tweet about the webinar. Please also tag India Rise TGII on Twitter. And now, my pleasure and honor to invite Dr. Arvind Gupta to address some questions about the way ahead for the Quad. Dr. Gupta, the Tokyo summit is seen as probably the most substantive meeting of Quad leaders so far. We have 4 meetings, and out of this, Tokyo summit marks the maturation, a culmination of some of the underlying themes that we've been building for years. What do you think were the major outcomes that will help India to promote its vital strategic interest? Looking ahead, how should India shape the direction in which the Quad will evolve in the future, and how can Quad play its role as a... You have 8 minutes. There are many questions linked up, but they're all linked up questions. So whatever you can address, otherwise we'll come back again. Over to you, Dr. Arvind Gupta.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Manish, for inviting me to this very important discussion and giving me this opportunity to share the panel with very eminent analysts and panelists, some of whom I have heard earlier also. And I think the discussion is very timely. And I must congratulate you for not only organizing this webinar, but also your masterly introduction, setting the scene for the Quad. And I think you made my task easier by focusing on some of the deliverables of the Tokyo summit, which I don't have to cover now. But I think the questions you have framed are also very relevant. And I do not know whether I have the answers to all of those questions, but certainly it will help clarify our thinking. The reason I say that is because I see Quad still as a process. It is a work in progress. 4 countries have got together for I think more than a decade. The Quad was dormant. Then it was revived. But in the last 1.5 years, it has certainly gathered pace and momentum. And I think the credit should go to the 4 leaders, but certainly to President Biden, I think, who has shown remarkable leadership. And first by hosting the first summit, and now we have had 4 summits within a matter of a year or so. So it's clear that there is a great deal of interest in Quad and political commitment to Quad. In fact, I think the distinctive feature of the Tokyo summit is, I would say, that it was held at a time of great flux in international relations and in the wake of the Ukraine war. And as is well known, there are differences between India and the other Quad member countries on Ukraine and how to, because India has not named Russia. And this could have, these differences could have derailed the Quad, but that did not happen. And that shows, says a lot about the maturity of the Quad leaders, that they are able to live with the differences. And the reason I think that is to be appreciated, this tendency, is because in future too, there could be differences. But since the Quad has developed a very positive and practical agenda in the last 2 years or so, it was possible for them to focus on some critical issues and not be lost in highlighting those differences. So you find that although there must have been a quite detailed discussion in the closed door meeting, but the statement has only a very, very brief reference to Ukraine, and that I think is good. So that is, I think, the maturity of the Quad. Some new initiatives were also announced, some were continuation. The agenda continues to expand, and whether it is climate action or whether it is cyber security or critical and emerging technologies or infrastructure. So you mentioned all of that. Uh, this, I think, makes Quad a very unique institution. That four countries, there are only four countries right now, and they have taken upon themselves a massive agenda, and it's a very practical agenda. And this agenda is essentially focused on the Indo-Pacific. So I think if the Quad countries are able to deliver on these very important agenda items, that will be a great plus for Quad. And this is also, I think, where the Quad has to be a little careful also, because the agenda seems to be expanding so fast. Whether they have the capability to implement and deliver in a timely and credible fashion to the diverse countries of the Indo-Pacific region, that I think will be a very big question for the Quad. So that's, I think, a note of caution is required. And this will also have a bearing on the further development of the Quad. For instance, on the vaccines, I saw a figure about 600 million doses have been given by the Quad countries to the world. But if I remember correctly, this vaccine initiative was really a defining feature of the first summit. And they had promised 1 billion vaccine doses to the Indo-Pacific by the end of this year. Whether they're able to reach that figure or no, I'm not very sure right now. Then there are many issues, they have identified the many through separate statements, clarifying the principles, whether it is on supply chains or critical and emerging technologies, etc. All this is very good, but it should not just remain on paper, because to handle supply chains disruptions, to handle critical infrastructure protection, or the cyber security, or now you're saying that they're going to have a space also. This is a very big agenda, and whether the four countries alone can do it or not is a question that I have in my mind. But it doesn't mean that they cannot do it. The fact is that the Quad was started. The Quad started as essentially a security dialogue, but now it has security is embedded in Quad. But I think hard security issues are being shunned. Whether it is good or bad, I think only time will tell, because there are huge security challenges. But the fact that the Indo-Pacific itself is evolving, and Quad is only just one institution. There are many other institutions which have also come up. For instance, AUKUS is one, and then you have IORA, which is also overlaps with the jurisdiction of Quad, and then you have ASEAN's East Asia Summit, and then you have all kinds of trilaterals and bilateral arrangements that have, like between Japan and Australia, that have come up. Malabar exercises are also there. So how does a Quad not overlook these security issues, I think, and not dilute its existence and the raison d'etre, in fact, that I think remains to be seen. But having adopted a positive agenda, and if it is able to implement, certainly it can emerge as a force for good. Briefly about India, I think India, in the early years of Quad evolution, India was seen as an outlier. Oh, India is not interested in hard security issues. And India had, in 2018, Prime Minister had given a statement at Shangri-La. He had talked about inclusive Indo-Pacific, which meant at that time it was interpreted that India doesn't want to take on China. But the fact is that we have had a Chinese aggression in 2020. But India has been, I think, careful not to, in fact, in some sense, restrain Quad from becoming purely a security alliance. And that's why many other elements have been added. All the elements which are there in the Quad agenda, they are very relevant for India, whether it is cyber security, whether it's climate action, whether it is pandemics or education or supply chains or critical energy and so on. These are very much a part of the Indian foreign policy, and these find mentioned in all our bilateral, joint statements that we issue with many other countries, etc. And there is a huge bilateral agenda which India is following with the Quad member countries and also in other fora. So I think the Quad is a very useful forum for India, and it also gives a certain visibility to India, both at the regional level and at global level. And it has already helped shape the Quad, and its present shape is very much, in fact, many of the Quad formulations are as if straight from Indian formulation. For instance, the one on terrorism that is there, which is so critical for India, that is very much there. And the last statement also mentioned Mumbai and Pathankot, and also the FATF, etc. We know what it means. So I think this is a very good development. So India has been able to leave its stamp on the Quad. Now, as far as future is concerned, I think there would be a effort to expand the Quad's engagement with other countries. Perhaps the Quad is not yet ready to take on new members, but I think that demand probably might grow in the future. Right now, Quad has to make an outreach first, improve its engagement, and become acceptable in the Indo-Pacific region. There's still many countries in the Indo-Pacific which are looking at Quad a bit cautiously because of the China factor that is involved. Many of them have very, close relations with China, and China itself is very anti-Quad. So I think it will be a while. But if the Quad is able to deliver on some of the positive agenda, I think Quad will become more acceptable. So in future, whether it's Europe, whether it is with ASEAN, or whether it is with other countries, I think Quad's engagement should improve. And they must find certain mechanisms of these engagements. Right now, there is no mechanism in terms of dealing with the non-Quad countries. So overall, I think I would say that Quad is now a very important part of India's foreign policy. It's a good vehicle for India to contribute to the shaping of the Quad and the regional order, and also benefit from some of the agenda items in their population. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for that big picture view of the Quad role in promoting India's vital national interest, apart from that of the region, and the expanding agenda of Quad. Now I come to Mr. Taniguchi. Mr. Taniguchi, how do you look at the commitment of the new Japan Prime Minister Kishida? The first major summit he hosted after becoming the Prime Minister of the country, and it was a very successful summit. But in terms of Japan's priorities of the Quad, what would that be? And I met you in Tokyo and spoke to you about India's role, and you're quite upbeat about Prime Minister Modi's contribution to the Quad. Maybe you'd like to speak a little bit on that as well. And finally, is there a Quad way of doing things? Over to you, Mr. Taniguchi.
Thank you, Manish. Those are very much relevant questions, and I would like to address those questions one by one. But first, listening to the previous speakers' analyses on Quad, I have just come up with 3 points that I would like to share with you, the members of the panel and the audience. That is based on the viewpoint of Tokyo that could differ from other viewpoints held by Australia, the United States, India, but nonetheless, Quad from the beginning is about seascape, not landscape. That's number one. Number two, Quad could not have come to being without a new geographic concept pushed forward, and that is Indo-Pacific. In the 1980s, if you look back, then two prime ministers of Australia and Japan got together and came up with a geographic concept of Asia Pacific. Based on that geographic concept, came into being the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC. Fast forward to 2010s, it was Shinzo Abe, based on his parliamentary address, Confluence of the Two Seas, proposed a new concept of Indo-Pacific. And Indo-Pacific concept always being mentioned, is always being mentioned with an adjective of free and open. So came another concept of free and open Indo-Pacific. We've been talking about the Quad being a seascape gathering, and then FOIP was its foundational concept. Thirdly, if it had not been for very much an outgoing, forward-looking Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, who was willing to break out the non-alignment mold, Quad, or for that matter, FOIP, couldn't have materialized. So those are the 3 points that I always associate with the emergence of this concept of Quad. Quad has been very much important for Japan to widen its breathing space or strategic space. Without it, Japan would likely be cornered into a narrow niche in the Far East or East Asia, with the resurgence of a gigantic power of China. Also, if you lose Japan, it would automatically mean that the great footprint of the US military would lose its value. So it's there is an equation here. If you lose Japan, you will lose US commitment in the region. And that awareness has brought the United States and Japan together to push this Quad concept forward. I think there is a great awareness, growing awareness among the Americans that given this massive power of China, it will become even harder still going forward for the United States alone to provide security to the region. So the United States badly needed allies, and that alliance relationships being readily provided by Japan and by the United States. And herein comes an importance of India, because the Chinese are looking at Indo-Pacific as a combined sum. And the Chinese Navy is busy building its presence in the Indian Ocean. Plus, Indian Ocean promises to become almost like the industrial highway for the 21st century's economy, with the rise of African economies as well. So Quad is also about the future. What else should I say? Because it is about the future, the hiccups you have in response to present day challenges should be overcome by the forward-looking nature of the Quad. Coming back to your first question about Japanese commitment, I think it's pleasantly surprising for me to see that previously the Japanese Prime Minister, who was previously dubbed dovish, has chosen to be very much buoyant and straightforward about Quad. And I think that tells you something, that there is a very much growing awareness, bipartisan awareness in this country, that without an institution such as Quad, Japanese security and the region's security, especially the security pertinent to Taiwan, would be in jeopardy. Prime Minister Kishida, as a result, has been very much supportive of that. People tend to look at Quad as a basket that could contain many different items. I wouldn't disagree with that presupposition, but I would like for leaders to focus their attentions first and foremost on the security environment. After all, had it not been for this gigantic neighbor, Quad could not have materialized. So foreign leaders have to stick to the core thread of Quad, namely security concerns. My final point is going to be that Quad is going to continue to work as a signaling institution. This great signaling effect is very much important, that four great democracies always shake hands with each other, work shoulder to shoulder with each other, and to set the goals and hurdles and the rules for the 21st century's economy, thereby providing incentives to our great neighbor of China. I'll stop here and look forward to further discussions.
Thank you, Mr. Taniguchi, for that, future-looking remarks, and especially, I really like that description for the Quad as a signaling institution. That every time there is a roots bending, a disruptive behavior by China or by any other power, there are these Quad countries can collectively say, look, this is not on, you can't get away with this. So that's really the point. And of course, it's also refreshing to see Japan's commitment. We come to the Honorable Lisa Singh. Australia was once considered the weakest link Quad, but now with the resurrection of the Quad, Australia has become a strong proponent, champion, prioritized, if I may say. And speculation was right till the very last minute about whether the new Australian PM, Albanese, would be able to attend the Quad summit in, but much to the surprise of man, to make it within hours of the swearing in. And all the leaders commended him. There could not have been more vivid evidence of his commitment. Building on that, what do you think will be Australia's priority for, especially as it hosts the summit next year? And also the unfolding story of India-Australia partnership, which also feeds into the momentum we are seeing in the Quad now. My question to you would be that how will stronger India-Australia relations further move the Quad? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Manish. And I have to say, with due respect, I think there was once a time where the United States was also seen as a member of the Quad that perhaps wasn't so strong. But I mean, we're not in the Quad 1.0 anymore. We're in the Quad 2.0, and I think that's where the commitment by all four countries is fairly rock solid, I would say, and we're in a whole new era. And that era, of course, has a number of challenges, but also a number of opportunities, some of which the speakers we've already heard this evening have shared with us. But from an Australian perspective, something has changed here in the last 3 weeks, and that is we've now got a new government. And it really is quite remarkable that on one day, our new Prime Minister was sworn in to office, that the votes still had not finished being counted. So we did not know whether we had a majority government here in Australia. And yet the next day, the newly sworn in Prime Minister Albanese was on a plane to Tokyo to meet 3 world leaders. I mean, really quite remarkable, and also showed the new government's commitment to the Quad, and also, of course, the importance of serving Australia's national interests, and also the new government's interests of peace and stability in the region. I think what was made clear through this new government's attendance at the Quad is they put a new stamp on what this government's focus is on, which of course is regional security, but it is also very much on a more enhanced package on aid and development, on diplomatic relations, and most importantly, climate change measures. And I think that signalling was very important by the new Australian government, because the next Quad Leaders Summit in 2023 will actually be held in Australia. So the scene has been set, so to speak, by our new Prime Minister, recognising the importance of climate change. And of course, in doing so, at that Quad Leaders Summit, it was not just to raise it as an environmental issue, but also as a national security issue, particularly in relation to the Pacific. And, we've obviously seen since the Quad Leaders meeting so much of that play out with the Chinese foreign minister's visit, and of course our own foreign minister's visit, to show our commitment to our Pacific family and what their issues are. And their issues, as has been articulated by the Fiji Prime Minister, is not geopolitics, it's climate change. And so I think it was really important that the Quad statement had climate change clearly made in there as a point of difference that this new Australian government was bringing to it and to the table. In fact, I think, that the topic of tonight's talk is something that President Biden himself said at the Quad, which is the Quad is not a passing fad, it's a force for good. So this force for good, I think, is worth exploring, because it does go beyond just the security basis by which perhaps we've been looking at the Quad since its inception. The fact that we are now focused, of course, of continuing to focus on peace and security and stability in the region, but also looking at future technologies, also looking at a range of issues through its working groups and the like, makes the Quad's agenda just so much more broader than what it set out with originally. So beyond those sorts of three priority areas of this a new Australian commitment that it brought to the Quad of regional security, climate change, and building diplomatic relations, clearly what Australia also wanted to focus on was the China factor. And I think this is where, of course, the leaders focused on the Ukraine Russia conflict, but of course that is a conflict that will come and go, whereas the China situation will remain. And this is where I think we need to have a much stronger focus on what we undoubtedly mean when we talk about the Quad as a force for good. Is it's talking about peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, ensuring a rules-based order in the region, and ensuring that Quad countries adhere to a set of values, a set of common interests that very much, define that peace and rules-based order. But in relation to China, if I can just go there, because it is very much and most important issue and foremost security challenge for India, as it is for other Quad members. I think the threat from China is obviously both direct and indirect. It is conventional and hybrid, and it will continue to play out in the so-called grey zone for most of the time. But this is where the Quad nations need to pull together to form intelligence gathering, to have a sharing platform and structure to ward off and deter any threats. And I think that establishment of intelligence gathering, a sharing mechanism, you know, needs to be sort of what we want to see coming out of the Quad as it continues to be a force for good. I think that you know, it's also recognised that both India and the US have the capability to sort of balance China militarily, so to speak. But as our friend from Japan said, you know, this is about seascape, not landscape. Yet for India, of course, it is that shared border with China, disputed border, that continues to play a landscape perhaps issue. I think one of the things I wanted to raise in terms of what's new in the recent Leaders Summit is the fact that the Quad is not only just now a security grouping with a force for good of other focuses in terms of climate and infrastructure and humanitarian assistance and the like, but it is also now becoming an economic partnership. And that is something that was new that came out of this particular Quad meeting. And I think it is quite significant in terms of India, and you know, significant in terms of what the next Quad leaders meeting will also focus on. So this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, as it was called and launched at this summit, IPEF, really is really going to sort of deepen the cooperation with these 4 countries in the sort of clean energy, supply chain resilience, and the digital trade space. And I think what's interesting in that, or what makes the IPEF more interesting, is that it, of course, you know, unlike RCEP, the IPEF includes India. So I think that's a really important factor to look at. And also, you know, these sorts of negotiating pillars it has, because it not only includes you know, clean energy and supply chains, but it includes anti-corruption as well. So I think that it really helps India, I think, get back into regional trade, some sort of regional trade forum potentially, as opposed to, you know, how India sort of left RCEP. But of course, we do need to look in terms of the Quad. This is a primarily US-led initiative at this stage. However, you know, I think all Quad countries are sort of committed to it. So look, you know, over and above what Australia sort of saw as the main takeouts of, you know, obviously I've talked about climate change being the most important for this, putting the new stamp on this new Australian government. You know, I think the overarching principles that the Quad stands for: freedom, rule of law, democratic values, sovereignty, territorial integrity, all of that, you know, clearly in the Quad's statement and reiterated by all of its leaders, is what is really the most important factor when we talk about, I think, the Quad being a force for good. In terms of Australia and India, I mean, what this new Labor government has said and acted on is that it has a bipartisan position on India, as the same as our last government. So I think you will continue to see the Australia-India relationship grow from strength to strength under this government. I think that commitment's been made clear, and particularly by Prime Minister Modi, who has already invited our new Prime Minister to India. Of course, we're hoping that we're signing a new free trade agreement by the end of this year. We have an interim trade agreement that was just recently signed, which has reduced tariffs or gotten rid of tariffs altogether on certain trading commodities. So, you know, I think that's a very positive signal for both of our countries. And I think the other component of this government is that it really wants to engage our growing Indian diaspora here in Australia, which of course are the second highest tax-paying diaspora in the country. So I think there's going to be a lot of scope for the two countries to continue to build the momentum, which has been enormous over the past few years to ensure that, you know, not only is there a stronger trading relationship, but of course a stronger bilateral geopolitical relationship, be it with each other or through the Quad. Of course, though, having said all that, this new government does have a focus on increasing both the geostrategic lens and an aid and development humanitarian lens into Southeast Asia and into the Pacific. And I think this is where both India and Australia, and indeed through the Quad as well, can play a greater role in supporting those small island states with some of the infrastructure needs they need and in the areas of climate change as well. So, you know, I think that's sort of where our new sort of Australian perspective lands. I think it's one that's very much in continuum in a lot of ways, but also has a new defining focus. And certainly the activities of both our Prime Minister and our Foreign Minister, in only being in office for 3 weeks, having already visited Japan, and our Prime Minister at least, and now Indonesia this week, and our Foreign Minister having been all over the Pacific as well, and also to those 2 countries, I think just shows how engaged this new government is in terms of the Indo-Pacific and upholding those important values and common interests that we all have through the Quad.
Thanks for Australian perspective, and especially I'm glad that you bring out the geoeconomic part of the Quad. You know, and my next speaker taking off from there would be I invite Sachin Chaturvedi, who has done quite a bit of work on trade pacts and trade agreements. Sachin, tell me, a day before the Quad summit, President Biden unveiled the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Prosperity, in the presence of Japanese Prime Minister, PM Modi and other leaders virtually. What joint statement subsequently supported the IPEF? How will IPEF help in providing economic content to the grouping? You know, so far it was seen primarily as continues to be seen as a geopolitics focused grouping, security grouping. What about the economic content? How can countries expand trade and investment? And as pointed out by Lisa, you know, after India dropped out of RCEP, is IPEF the big opportunity India has been looking? Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Manish, for this opportunity and for raising issues which are extremely pertinent in terms of how the larger narrative on Indo-Pacific is unfolding. I think previous speakers have captured very well, and I must thank Lisa for touching on this very important dimension of RCEP and India being out of that. So I think it is extremely pertinent for us to bring in this whole question of how we take this forward. And as Manish, you very rightly said, the Indo-Pacific concept now has these 2 pillars of security and trade and economic growth. And these 2 pillars, I think, are now providing the strength which we heard from Ambassador Arvind Gupta in terms of how we take that collectively forward. And this is, I think, where IPEF's concept comes in. And I think Lisa is not there that the concept has come from the US. The bandwagon has all the right noises that the US would like to hear. The 6 features that the US has identified, I mean, if you focus on trade facilitation, which was in Bali WTO ministerial, the low-hanging fruit, and all of us agreed to that, I think is an important dimension of it. But more, I think, is the concern which we heard from Tomohiko-san in terms of the supply chain resilience that we need in the region. And that, I think, squarely addresses the huge challenge that the region is facing. And that's where, though India being out of RCEP, but being part of Quad, I think helps. It is not only going to be advantageous to the countries that are there, but also to our partner countries, particularly countries like Indonesia and others, which are also going to be hugely benefiting out of the efforts that we are making for bringing resilience in the region as far as supply chain is concerned. The third part is very much about infrastructure. And we are seeing the downside of the Belt and Road Initiative. It is not just about finance and sovereign debt crisis. It is going deeper there in terms of the carbon footprint, in terms of the monopoly, the whole inflation that we are seeing in terms of China blocking access to containers and the excessive containerization that we could achieve in last couple of years as part of the collective trade facilitation agreements that came in, the effort that China has made in terms of blocking the oil containers across the regions. I think we owe some arrangement to our fellow developing countries in terms of how we do that. And this is important in terms of the third feature of IPAF, which is about infrastructure building, about the trade facilitating measures that are needed for investment. And this, I think, is important for all the countries that are there. The fourth feature of the IPAF, which US has announced, is bringing in the idea of standards for digital economy and technology. And this, again, Manish, I think is extremely important, given the points that Japanese G20 presidency introduced. And that was largely in terms of identifying how we promote digital trade. India had different positions. India has different position on data for development, on how we leverage data, the cross-border flow of data. But as Prime Minister Modi has been saying, we need to have deeper dialogue in terms of how we overcome these differences. With India assuming the G20 presidency next year, it would be even more important for us to work with Quad countries to see how global consensus may emerge. And that way, the idea of we working together with Japan and with US in terms of standards for digital economy and technology, I think is extremely important. With Australia, a separate track for our trade agreement has already been launched. In fact, Australia and New Zealand are the two countries that are out of that. Otherwise, we already have some sort of trade agreement with each member of the East Asia Summit process. And that, I think, is important. The fifth feature that is there for IPEF for us to consider is about decarbonization and clean energy. The Indian commitment on just transition, the German new proposal that has come up at G7, which fortunately, as some of us were invited as part of the outreach of German presidency, and the proposal of climate club that has come in, I think is important. There is growing sort of consensus in terms of how we evolve a strategy, but there is consensus in terms of need for strategy. How we evolve it, how do we reach there? There are some points of differences. The idea of climate club that is being discussed as part of G7 German presidency is very much on table. US emphasis on decarbonization and the assistance that has been given to a couple of countries for just transition, I think is something which is important. India has raised the issue of access to green finance. And this is what I think I would like to mention when Lisa was absolutely right when she was mentioning that it is largely led by US. I think we need to bring back on the table idea of access to finance and how we do the sort of delicate balancing between the development space and the climate change. So complete blackout on financing of coal, I think is one important dimension. How much is the agreement at COP26 in terms of the net zero? To what way we've moved towards that net zero, what time for transition we have, and how countries balance mitigation and development priorities. And this is where some differences are there among countries, but I'm sure at the Quad platform, the countries have endorsed US idea of decarbonization and clean energy as a broad objective. The last point is very much about workers' standards. And this, I think, is important from the point of view of countries that are bringing in new energy there. And that's where I think, Manish, important in terms of the points that Prime Minister Modi raised in 2019 when Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative was launched by India, and his emphasis in terms of maritime ecology, maritime resources, and capacity building for resource sharing, something that has also appeared in the Quad Declaration. The fact that US could provide scope for Quad fellowships, almost 100 of them, for students to come to the United States is something which is extremely interesting and extremely important from the point of view of how we collectively make the efforts of taking that forward, also through maritime domain awareness. That is precisely what was discussed. The idea is also on table in terms of disaster risk reduction and management, something that India was saying. So IPEF, that way, Manish, is bringing in the points which are important for the region. They are important for all our actors and also for our partners. I see my time is up. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for those very pithy and pointed remarks on how to deepen the economic content. And I'm also glad you touched on some of those initiatives which bring very tangible benefits to the region, well, disaster mitigation, other aspects. Now I move on to Nancy Snow, who's on public diplomacy initiatives, communication. Nancy, in Japan, coming back to the question about Quad as a force for public, the branding of Quad, listening of the Quad, there has been a sustained propaganda, may put it, to represent Quad as some sort of, to portray Quad in Asian NATO, a divisive and polarizing force. And, this really obfuscates the value of the grouping, what the grouping is about. So it's good to see that the joint statement in Tokyo endorses the positioning of Quad as a force of public good. And also in this context, there was a meeting of Quad foreign ministers in Melbourne in February, if I'm right, where information, countering misinformation about Quad was identified as opportunity. Talk briefly about what's Quad do. They coordinate their information strategy, public diplomacy strategy, to keep the focus on the concrete benefits, people-centric initiatives, which the Quad is trying to do. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And as a public diplomacy scholar and also a propaganda scholar, you gave me a lot to work with here. I'm a US citizen and I'm a Tokyo resident. So the Quad has really hit home with me in terms of security. It's interesting, when I live in the US, I may feel less secure at an interpersonal level. I live here in Tokyo feeling very secure because of the incredible safety record that Japan overall has. But when I think of this slogan really of a force for good, that's a lot to work with as well. I think it can be very appealing to young people and can bring them in, especially if we view security at that level from the interpersonal to international, because not everybody's going to be brought into the Quad process and caring about it if they just think of it as military. And when we think of national priorities, diplomatic, informational, military, economic, they've all been touched upon here. But at this level of becoming a more responsible, democratic member of international society, the Quad has incredible promise. And I wouldn't focus so much as a strategic communications person on trying to defend this counter propaganda to the Quad. If we represent really what the Quad stands for, and we deliver. We have specific actions that we deliver on beyond the rhetoric that is nevertheless important: democratic values, focus on climate change, sustainability. If we focus on what we do the best, and this is a powerhouse of population and intellect and leadership, then we don't have to spend our energies and emotional energies on trying to resist the counter propaganda. You get counter propaganda when you're doing something that is threatening. And but threat doesn't always have to lead to worst case scenarios. It could be competition. And I think that there's an opportunity for healthy competition here. All 4 Quad members deal with China regularly, economically. We're all dependent on China now. And I actually teach in China at Schwarzman College at Tsinghua. And I've been involved with Tsinghua for years, and teach in Japan. So there are ways that we can be a bridge really here as Quad members. But I would like to see, beyond the Quad fellows to the US, I'd like to see much more engagement and exchange of persons among the Quad members. Because I think for the young people I talk to, sometimes 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds, what do they care about? They care about a sense of security about the future. And for them, that means human security. It's a much broader term. It involves sustainable development goals. And the Quad is involved in that. So as a process, as becoming something that I think will go from strength to strength, we need to look at it within this landscape of what does it mean across generations of youth to elderly, and really bring in much more of a constituency than just, you know, elite nation states communicating with each other. So that's why I'm on this panel, is to learn from these experts on Quad and to help you deliver that message to a broader audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for very, very precise and pointed observation. And this is the way to go. I think the Quad Fellowship was a very important part of what emerged out of it, the launch of the fellowship. It was decided to do this, or decided at the last summit, but finally it was launched. And just to tell me, you know, the young people ask when I talk to them about Quad, they talk about the Quad Fellowship. They're not so much interested in geopolitics and security. So I'm glad you bring that out, and also the need for better communication about that. Now I invite Dr. Richard Rosso. Basically, I wanted to address this, that do you think the Tokyo summit addressed some of the security issues facing the region? And secondly, you know, Quad, over the last two in-person summits, have set up various working groups and work streams. Rick, would you have some specific ideas how to improve, how to streamline those working groups that, you know, Quad can deliver what it intends to? Over to you.
Thanks, Manish. Well, it's just it is terrific too to be the last speaker on such a distinguished group and have at least a couple of ideas that hadn't been brought up yet. So so that's a lot of fun. Thanks everybody else for sharing at least a couple of areas. There's three things I'm going to talk about: improving today's work streams that we have in the Quad, looking at the work streams that have to be built out for tomorrow, and then the future structure of the Quad. So today's work streams, you know, it is very focused, and I think primarily because India, you know, mainly has not wanted this to become yet a security focused architecture. It's focused on areas to degrade China's ability to use coercive commercial policies. And that's great. I mean, these are areas that I think all of our countries have faced in the very recent past. You know, you got areas of strategic infrastructure, rare earths and critical minerals, strategic technology, active pharmaceutical ingredients, things like that. I think these are all very welcome. I will quibble a bit, I think, some of the emphasis we've had so far on the working group on climate. I really don't think the Quad is the place for a working group on climate. If we're talking specifically about breaking China's stranglehold on global production of things like solar panels, where 70% of all of our solar panels come from China, great. But if it's about strategy on climate, there's other forums that are purpose built for that. And I think, you know, something that Tom mentioned before, this is very much a security focused group, you know, that doesn't fit. The initial Quad COVID cooperation did, less so now. You know, it's got to be things that have security, and particularly, again, degrading China's ability to use coercive commercial policies. Now, the gap that I see in the work streams as they exist right now is that you don't yet see an avenue or platform to engage the private sector. All of these are going to require private firms from Japan, from Australia, from India, and the United States to step up and take advantage of things our diplomats are creating. And if they create architectures and structures and policies and ideas that our private firms aren't ready to grab onto and run with, they're going to be dead on arrival. And China will continue to run the table in these areas. So first and foremost, we have got to find platforms for inducting private sector ideas. Do we have confidence that our diplomats that are defining the Quad work streams really understand how pharmaceutical companies find new sources of active pharmaceutical ingredients? When we talk about regional infrastructure, the United States response is, we don't have a big bank, we're going to rely on the private sector. Where does US infrastructure money come from? It comes from pension companies and life insurance companies. These are the most risk-averse industries in the United States of America. And when you talk about some of the markets where we'd be competing with China for infrastructure investment, they don't have developed capital markets. They don't have debt markets. They don't necessarily have perfect rule of law or courts that we can trust. So when you try to get the most conservative investors in the United States to be the spearhead on confronting China's infrastructure investments in the region, it's dangerous. So, you know, mitigating those risks is going to be one of the ways to unlock private sector. But overall, when we talk about, you know, rare earth development, pharmaceutical ingredients, infrastructure, we got to make sure private sector has a very strong voice. And we also have to be very wary that there's parity in opportunities. If our diplomats are out there and they're carving out new opportunities, and all of them accrue to American companies or Japanese companies or Australian companies or Indian companies, if too many of the resulting commercial opportunities do go a little bit heavy to a subset of the four countries, that will kind of erode, I think, interest in the others. If India looks at this in 3 years and says, wow, you know, another $80 billion in trade was unlocked because of the Quad cooperation and Indian firms got zero, that's really going to erode interest in continuing to engage. So being thoughtful as well, because American companies are terrific at sitting right outside the doors of our State Department or our Commerce Department and realizing an opportunity and jumping on it. We need to make sure that not every opportunity necessarily comes to American firms. So that's some thoughts on today's work streams. Focus on the ones that have security overlay, induct the private sector, and make sure that there's parity. Tomorrow's work streams, there's some areas that are missing. We've talked a little bit on military cooperation. That has got to be highlighted much more deeply in the agenda. We can't wait. China's not waiting. We can't wait. And the Quad is going to be a big deal in pushing back. Now, we need to be thoughtful on this. And I think you saw some initial elements on information fusion, on humanitarian assistance, disaster relief in the most recent Quad summit. So that's pretty important. I think at least, you know, we're nudging there. But, you know, I think we could all, I think, have a pretty good argument over whose fault it was the Quad collapsed the first time. Hearing the United States get pointed at, that's relatively new, but I understand it. Australia, India come up a lot. You know, at the end of the day, you know, we need to make sure that everybody's interests are aligned. And when the United States announced our own Indo-Pacific concept, you know, the first question that came to us from India was, what did the Indo mean? Was it a ploy to drag India into the Pacific conflicts that the United States, most security analysts think are tier one? South China Sea, East China Sea, the Straits, you know, that's what at the top level, most American analysts that look at Indo-Pacific think of as the tier one threats. The Indian Ocean is contested waters. And many Indian analysts would say that in the next 20 years, India may no longer be the dominant navy in their own neighborhood. I mean, think about that. We have the moment now where we can head that off, create structures to make sure that that's not the case, that India retains primacy, supported by friends, and there's very little being done in that direction right now. And we can't wait. So Indian Ocean, when we think about security cooperation, is important. We also need to step into looking at coordinated sanctions. Using our economic heft, when the next time that China announces a steep hike on duties on Australian wine, that these four countries consult and immediately come up with a counter package together, confer real penalties on China for using economic coercion against any of the Quad members or other friendly nations. Real penalties. We can do that now. India's announcing bans on Chinese apps. The rest of us should be jumping on board because we know there is no wall between Chinese private firms and information the Communist Party wants to get. There is no wall. We know that. So we should all be acting in concert when we see that there are damages to our population society by some of these steps China takes. Shared investment reviews. China's still trying to make investments in all of our countries. We all have our own process for investment reviews. Are we sharing that intelligence with each other seamlessly? If we find there are dangers to this investor, bam, press a button and get that immediately in the hands of our partners. Even if that same firm is not looking at making an investment in the other countries, make that happen seamlessly and immediately. It's a no-brainer. Get it done now. And lastly, I would like to see the Quad move into some bigger trade agreement. But we can park that for now because I'm already running short on time. Future structure, just two things to mention. Membership comes up a lot. And for me, I think the preferred model would be a little bit like the United Nations. These four countries are the Security Council. They define the agenda. They have a veto on other initiatives. But lay it out so that other countries can begin to contribute in the Quad work streams and join. They won't help define the agenda, except in spaces maybe we have comfort. But I think a UN structure is very smart. And I do think that we need to start thinking already, if folks in Tier 1 haven't already, about what an actual standing secretariat looks like. These work streams are great, but they're going to involve a lot of action and daily activities. And I do think having senior teams from all four countries that are engaging, not just when summits happen, but on a more regular basis and not just virtually, is useful. The time may not be quite there yet, but it will be very soon. And I think thinking about that now rather than later is a good idea. So I'll wrap it up at that, Manish. Throw a few hopefully new ideas on the table here and happy to take any questions.
Right. Thanks, Rick. I think being the last speaker helps sometimes. Good to see so much energy in your ideas. And thank you for those very constructive suggestions way forward. Now I come to questions from the audience. The first question is from, wait, let's see. This is an issue which has been talked about much, both in the run-up to the Tokyo summit and otherwise. How has the Russia-Ukraine war affected the relationship among the Quad members? Can Mr. Taniguchi, maybe you'd like to address that? Has the Ukraine issue impacted the Quad solidarity? Rick, maybe you also like to address this? Yeah. First, I first invite Mr. Taniguchi to take on that question.
The short answer to that question, Manish, is not really. Three leaders from the United States, Australia, Japan seemed to have chosen to be less vocal about the stance and position India has chosen vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. That evinces the fact that Quad is about the future, not the present. But I should also say that it would have been much, much better if we have heard more from people like you, Manish, pundits in India, clarifying the position of India as to why India does what towards Russia and Ukraine. If I were in that position, I would have said, yes, without ammo coming from Russia, we couldn't fight against Chinese. However, if you look at the tendency, we are buying fewer and fewer, less and less from Russia, whereas China has increased a great deal the quantity of ammunitions and weapons that the Chinese are buying from Russia. So you've got to look at the trend line that tells what India is doing with Russia. And Narendra Modi could have said, you know that India is a democracy And short of saying that our marriage with Russia is not a marriage of heart, it's a marriage of convenience.
Rick?
I'd say, from DC's perspective, I would say outside the administration and even some senior voices in the administration came out pretty harshly and pretty critical of India's position or non-position on the invasion. And I know leading up to our major 2+2 summit that took place in DC in April, there was a lot of concerns, about how we were going to hold the relationship hostage to whether India stepped up at this moment to take a tougher position on Russia. And I would say, luckily, I think the Biden administration decided not to use that moment. And you saw at the last minute, the president himself reached out and wanted to have a preview conversation directly with Prime Minister Modi, I think to get the ships set on the straight and narrow. That yes, as friends, we'd like to see India's position evolve, but we weren't going to hold the relationship hostage over this. And I'm glad to see that happen. I think those of us that engage at the micro level and see the development of our relationship vis-a-vis the other bigger threat, China, and the fact that, frankly, an Indian voice in this debate wouldn't make a big difference in Putin's calculations, I don't think. I'm pretty comfortable. The only downside, I think, is that some of India's position and what you hear publicly is driven, by this Russian disinformation narrative. I was just in Delhi too, and I constantly hear thrown back at me that it's Ukraine's fault, it's NATO's fault, and it's America's fault, rather than the person that did the invasion. And that this false thing that there had been a promise of no NATO expansion in the East, which even Gorbachev himself said was not part of the package that gets referred to a lot of times, even in the mainstream in India, in media. You saw this terrific New York Times expose, where in the weeks after the invasion, the hashtag I support Putin, that almost a quarter of all the accounts, the Twitter accounts that had this I support Putin, came from India. And it turns out most of them were bots. So India actually became ground zero as well for the disinformation campaign that Putin attempted to destabilize, the narrative globally. So, I wish that some of India's position wasn't driven by these points, but overall, I'm comfortable with where we landed. And I'm glad the Biden administration has chosen to focus on the long term.
Thanks, Rick. The next question is from Vijay Nayak, a senior journalist, talking about what it will take for the Quad, or how can the Quad actually change China's on South China. I mean, signaling is one thing, but can the Quad effectively change China's policy? May I invite the Honorable Lisa Singh and Arvind Gupta to respond to?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit too far to say that the Quad can change China's policy. I mean, only China can change China's policy. I think what the Quad can do is, continue to, continue to show that it's, unlike what I think China has called it, which is an Asian NATO, that it is a grouping that, not underpinned by a treaty, not with a secretariat. It's a group of like-minded countries that actually have a shared vision of a free and open and connected, secure Indo-Pacific, and they're going to continue to, ensure that those sort of security issues are addressed as four countries that sort of want to pursue that important agenda for a peace and stable Indo-Pacific region. And I think the Quad's got a lot of work to do to make that happen. And I think, we've heard a lot from our speakers tonight in that space. And one of those areas I think, we haven't sort of delved too deeply into is the Indian Ocean. There's a lot of focus on the South China Sea, as the questioner has said, but the Indian Ocean is equally as significant for all sorts of trading routes and security concerns. So, I think that the Quad doesn't need to focus on changing China's policy. I think the Quad needs to focus on its own agenda. And I think you're right. As Rick said, it has got very broad, that agenda. And the question's got to be asked, why does it keep adding on and on these working groups, which, are addressing things that are done in other fora, other sort of minilateral, multilateral fora. So having said that, I mean, we are calling this a force for good. And in a sense, I think there are pros and cons to the Quad broadening its agenda and showing that it's got a bigger sort of security base that brings in people, not just the hard power side. But I think that goes back to the fact that, of course, the Quad was created out of a humanitarian crisis with this 2004 tsunami. So, you know, I think there's a lot of sort of focus that needs to be played out, particularly in the next leaders meeting. And we need to also take stock of the fact that these leaders meetings have only just happened in the last 12 months. So, you know, this is early days. This is an evolving Quad 2.0. I think as long as it does, you know, continue to focus on the important security agenda for the region, then it doesn't really need to keep looking at, you know, what's China's policy. It's more what are China's threats.
All right. So would you like to add something to this?
I'll add something. I love the appearance of your black cat, Lisa. And that can be a bad or a good omen, but I'll take it as a very good omen as a cat lover. So I think is the question about the Indian Ocean, I would just like to add that I believe that may be the lane through which the Chinese Navy could get to the Persian Gulf, right? So that makes it even more significant. And we need to pay closer attention to it than just talking about the South China Sea. I mean, to us here in Japan, that's the main focus, but the broader map is really critical, going back to Tomohiko's comment about the seascape here.
All right. Dr. Gupta, would you like to add something? Move on to the next question about how China can, how Quad can, you know, modify China's behavior as well. South China Sea.
I think it's difficult for Quad to change China's behavior. China is not unduly concerned about the Quad. It has dismissed Quad as a foam on the sea in the past, though of course it is also concerned in one sense that if the military cooperation among these countries increases, then China gets concerned. But the Quad has taken a conscious decision not to focus on hard security issues. And perhaps, although China is the subtext of the Quad, but many of these initiatives will bear fruit only in the long term, where they can perhaps counter Chinese influence, like in the BRI, etc. But I don't think in any direct manner the Quad will be able to change China's behavior in South China.
Right. Okay, I have last 2-3 questions. You know, Quad has taken a major initiative on technology, critical and emerging technology. This is open to any panelists. What can Quad do to enable technology transfer? Taniguchi, Mr. Rosso, do you have any idea what more can be done in the realm of technology transfer?
Yes, once again, I would like the Quad arrangement to focus primarily on security issues. Hardcore military security issues, of course, but security issues in more broad terms. Then we're going to be discussing what sort of technology transfers and exchanges should happen among these 4 nations that are pertinent to beefing up our military and security technologies. So there must be much more intensity in dialogue between India and Japan, for instance, as to how to build mutual military capabilities. And I would love the Australians to look afresh at Japan's submarine technologies that Japan could offer still to the Australians. So that's what I should say. we're talking a lot about semiconductors and resilient supply chain and so on and so forth. But I would like to come back again to the core crux of the arrangement. Now, let me just add something about the previous question. South China Sea is very much important in order for China to hide its nuclear-powered attack submarines. But over the next 5-6 years, it's going to be very much a critical period as to what could happen over Taiwan. Xi Jinping is going to get elected again, third time in a row this autumn, and he's going to be given a 5-year term that would expire in 2027. The next 5 years is going to be a window in which Xi Jinping must prove that he has fulfilled the pledge to bring back the Chinese dream, bring back the so-called territorial integrity. And then if you lose Taiwan from the equation, you will have had an entirely different security picture throughout the Indo-Pacific region. So Taiwan is the focal point. And I don't think Quad could change in any way the Chinese behavior over Taiwan or over South China Sea. But the question to be posed is the following. Were it not for our grouping, were it not for Quad, would that be, what kind of environment would that be? What's lacking in China is this grouping. Ambassador Emmanuel from the United States, Rahm Emanuel from the United States, famously has said a number of times, we don't have to isolate China because China is already isolated. They don't have allies, they don't have friends to count upon. We have a group of like-minded countries, and that actually gives positive incentives throughout the region and to the Chinese as well. ASEAN centrality, someone asked that question as well. Very briefly, ASEAN has never taken up a role to look beyond Southeast Asia. So their focus is very much regional. And when it comes to Southeast Asian nations, we all value ASEAN's contribution. And I think ASEAN is entitled to sit behind the wheel when it comes to the ASEAN matters, Southeast Asian matters. But when it comes to broader Indo-Pacific region, I think that's the Quad that should play a role. Thank you.
Right.
From the U.S. perspective, Manish, you asked me as well on this one. I mean, it comes up a lot, you know, and I would say especially to Tom's point on the defense side, where India kind of holds it out as, you know, one of those things India would like to see crossed for the next evolution in defense cooperation. And I'll say from the U.S. perspective, we've tried more things with India than with any other country. But it's really, really hard because almost all U.S. defense tech is held by the private sector. So how do you go to a private company and say, you know, India wants access to the root technology to develop on their own, you know, can we give it to them? You know, the answer is going to be no, as it should be. You know, no private firm that invested in that would ever want to give that up voluntarily, but they tried. They created the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, where they went and they actually got hundreds of platforms that at least they were willing to engage in conversation. You know, we had a dozen conversations. There's a few projects they tried to get off the ground. But when it comes to contracting, you know, it's been really hard. They created the only country in the world that has a program like that. The only country in the world that has a dedicated team inside the Pentagon. It's called the India Rapid Reaction Cell. And their job is to expedite technology transfer approvals. But, you know, again, you know, India is a reluctant buyer sometimes. Even when India says they want to move in new domains and acquire new technologies, we pre-approve things even before the process is moving, and it never gets bought. You know, how many times can you go through that? So matching up the systems is still something that I think we have to continue to work on and strengthen and improve. We are unilaterally freeing a lot of our control regimes. So India can buy most of the areas of technology. So when they say they want it, you know, we may not be able to give it, but it is for sale. And and then of course signing the cooperative agreements, the geospatial agreement, the CONCASA, things like that. So we are clearing the decks of a lot of things the governments can do. But unfortunately, what a lot of times India puts on the table is access to root technology defense equipment that the government cannot do because it's controlled by the private sector. Now, the one other avenue that I think that we may have some promise, well, I'd say two. One is the Quad Fellows program. If our kids are jointly researching, coming up with the next big idea, it's laying seeds, and probably it's our kids that are going to see the the real gestation from that. But it's got to start from there, because if Lockheed invested $20 billion in building something, they're not going to hand it over. But if we have really smart kids getting together and they're co-ideating and they come up with something new, that adds a little more promise. Second is, I think the aircraft carrier working group is a model we should be looking to replicate. Showcase great technologies that are on offer, not just like saying that we approved a control regime, but to bring Indian folks on U.S. aircraft carriers and showcase the technologies, and as India's building their own, I think replicating that. And the one project I think we should do immediately is creating a similar working group on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. India's strategic dominance of that is going to be really important for the United States to sit there and showcase all the sensing technology, port security technologies, and do a couple of showcase demonstration programs that can really get the most out of this important, listening post and stuff would be phenomenal. But, those kind of things like our aircraft carrier working group should replicate it to showcase, what these technologies can do better than, we'd ever do simply by moving an export control regime. So there's a few ideas.
All right. Thanks for that, Rick. Now, probably second last question. Question is from Dina Raina. She asked, should Quad be expanded? Should the grouping invites other members to expand its influence, make it more effective? What is the view of the panel? Anyone can briefly talk about it. Dr. Gupta, Nancy, Lisa, any idea? Do you have any view on this?
Well,
I just want to
okay.
just say something as far as the expansion, just put that aside for a second. Living here in Japan, we need much more discussion about security, about defense than is going on. And part of the reason it doesn't go on is because it's a sensitive issue when you talk about the military. The US military is here. Many Japanese on the mainland have never even been to Okinawa, where the dominant forces are. And that peace brand of Japan has really been formidable for 70 plus years. And so when you raise questions of increasing the defense budget, maybe from 1% of GDP to 1.5, probably not up to 2%, or you talk about adjusting the Constitution and changing the dynamic of the self-defense forces. We're just not having that conversation, not at the university by and large, not in the general population. It's a sensitive issue. And I think that has to change. The way it could be changed is if we talk about it broadly as peace and stability and defense, because people can relate to defending sovereignty, territory, those democratic values that were mentioned earlier.
Dr. Gupta, would you like to comment on it? On expansion of the Quad?
Yeah, I think this is still a work in progress, and it's perhaps too early for any new members to come in. The Quad has to prove itself first. So I would say that this is probably not the right time to take in new members. But at the same time, the 4 countries alone cannot implement all the big agenda that they have taken on board. So engagements should be a preferred way of doing it. And they must think of some mechanisms whereby they can engage with the other countries.
Right.
I would agree. The name speaks for itself. It's a group of 4 countries.
Right.
So it takes a little bit of time for it to establish firm brand recognition, so to say.
Right.
Now, Nancy, a lot of debate has been going on about security. Abe's prime minister's office was surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people every day, 7 days a week, when Shinzo Abe tried hard to legislate a new security bill. So I do understand why you say what you just said, but this country has gone quite a far, and the Japanese defense spending, as opposed to its GDP, is 1.24 if you adopt NATO standard. To a minor correction, if I may.
Manish,
I
can
was
I
just
just
going to add that.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, Arvind. I mean, there's been a bit of debate here in Australia about Quad Plus for a while, you know, to include South Korea. I mean, I agree with, you know, everyone else. Is just that it's the Quad. It's already got 6 leader level working groups. It's got a huge agenda already. I don't see at this stage the value of Quad Plus, but it could be something that could be developed into the future, depending on, you know, what plays out in the region.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you know, protest is one thing. That's not the same as debate. So, I mean, people were protesting, I agree, because they wanted to, they like living with the idea of a nonviolent nation and a peaceful nation. It's very attractive to other people throughout the world to come to Japan, which stands for peace and nonviolence. So I'm just saying that you have to put it in a larger context and have full-fledged debate, which, you know, people protesting, that went away. They're not protesting on that now, but they will if we raise this issue again.
You know, in the Japanese language, magazines and newspapers, hardly a day goes by without looking at those discussions going on.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, very distinguished speakers, fabulous audience, which has been there right till the end. The time has come to conclude this webinar. There are many questions that have been sent on email as well, but we cannot possibly go on, especially with speakers from Australia and Japan who probably may be feeling a little sleepy. But that apart, this discussion can go on and on. Thank you so much for your contribution, suggestion. This is an ongoing debate. What remains a work in progress. And what is really surprising is that the grouping, which are almost written off 3-4 years ago, till there was a quiet meeting in Singapore, Singapore, in Manila, 2017. And that set in motion a chain of events leading to the resurrection of the grouping. And now what we see, the 4 summits, in-person. So thought remains a work in progress, it's evolving, it's branching out into new ideas. And, you know, as the topic today's the webinar was titled, Slowly Possibly. There is something called the Quad Way, which is probably getting firmed up. And Quad is entrenching its reputation as a force for good. And in the end, it will not be geopolitics or even geoeconomics, but very concrete benefits to transform the lives of people in the region. And that will be the yardstick by which that's the big judge. We can go on. Thanks so much. I just like to conclude, with something which Prime Minister Modi said in the address to the US House of Congress, 2016. And you were talking in the context of India-US relations, where he had said that the orchestra have sufficiently tuned their instruments. The baton has given the signal. There's a new symphony in play. He was quoting Walt Whitman, the American. So there is a new symphony here. which is in play among the major liberal democracies spanning 3 continents. And there is so much more to do for peace and prosperity of the region and the world and humanity. Thank you once again for your contribution. We will be publishing the proceedings of this webinar in the next edition of our magazine, which will come out within a week's time. We'll get back to some of to you. If you have anything more to add to that, that would be great, because I want it to be a future-looking document that last 90 minutes have generated some concrete suggestion to take the call forward onto the next stage. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye-bye
All
for
right.
now.
Thank you. See you again. Yeah. All right.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.